Welcome, everyone. My name's Robin Heisick. I am an employee with Pink Elephant. We are here really for a two-part webinar. You will get enough out of today, so if you can't make it next Thursday, that will be okay, although I hope that you could join us next Thursday at the same time in the same room, same bat station, we'll call it, for the second part of our webinar. This two-part webinar is really about managing projects successfully, although we want to add in here, it's really about managing projects that include an element of change, organizational change, or really where we're going is people change successfully. If you have a project that does not impact people, and I'm having a hard time trying to come up with a project that doesn't impact someone, then maybe this isn't as important, but the minute we are impacting people, including ourselves, the decision of the project, we do need to think about how the change impacts us and how do we as leaders of change or project managers that involve change involve stakeholders. So today we're talking about stakeholder engagement, defining who are our stakeholders that could be affected by our change initiative. The way we are going to proceed is I'll talk for about 20, maybe 25 minutes, and then I'll take any questions that are in the Q&A section. So feel free to type the questions as we go and as you have them. But again, remember, I'll be answering them at the end. So a few topic areas here, which why do we care about stakeholders? And now that we know about why we care about them, who are they anyway? And then what is important to them? Next week, as we said, we'll talk about once we understand who the stakeholders are, how do we draw up effective communication to get them to buy into our change and to support their needs going through the journey of our change initiative. Today we will cover 7 principles of stakeholder engagement. You're not going to see them all on this slide, but by the time we finish my set of slides, you will have seen each of the 7 principles with information about each one. I find the very first principle, and by the way, these principles come to us through a gentleman by the name of Patrick Mayfield. I have in the end of our presentation a reading list or a resource list, so you'll be able to see and I'll point out where you could get information when we get to that slide. The very first principle that I think is really important and one that is easy to remember is principle 1. You can forget important stakeholders, but they won't forget you. So think about that for a brief second. Think about a time where you were either involved with initiating a project that required people to change or involved in it, or you were a stakeholder of someone else's change, where someone was not properly informed, not properly included, maybe because we didn't think they had anything to gain or lose from this change, and all of a sudden they bubbled up and were really influencing a change in the direction we didn't want it to be going in. And so the statement here, or the quote here, failure to attend to the concerns of our stakeholders is a flaw in thinking. We sometimes are in a hurry, or sometimes we forget to think about all the stakeholders that might be impacted, and doing that is going to lead us down the wrong path of our change, either to poor performance, outright failure, or even disaster. So again, I'll pause for a couple seconds for that to hit home for you and to think about changes that you were either involved in initiating or the recipient of, and that was the cause of not paying careful attention to stakeholders. All right, but we'll move on. That was a quick pause. So what is a stakeholder? So we say, okay, we're talking stakeholders. We're here for 30 minutes together. This definition of a stakeholder is very general. So a stakeholder, any group or individual or organization that has an interest in your change initiative or the outcomes that change initiative will produce, outcomes that might be very specific or personal to some stakeholders. So in terms of that being general, stakeholders can affect or be affected by a change. So stakeholders aren't just those people who we're deploying new software to, who we are changing roles in an organization, or we are altering business process. It could be people who are able to affect or influence that, as well as those people who will call for now targets that seem to be the direct impact. Going broader, people can perceive to be affected by the change. And so if we aren't carefully managing all stakeholders, we might have people who we thought, well, they're not included, but they don't know that they're not included. They don't know that they're not impacted. And of course, when some changes are announced, we have people, including ourselves, who are nervous about it and perceived to be affected by the change, whether they will be or not. Now, this effect can be positive, negative, or neutral. And the stakeholder can be internal or external to the organization. So again, if we go back to the definition in pink above, any individual, group, or organization with an interest in the change of its outcomes, and then go down with more criteria, I hope that you can see from here, this could be just about anyone. All right, so how do we then, if it's just about anyone, how do we identify these stakeholders? And before we go into a brief list of techniques, let's look at the bottom at principle number 2. Principle number 2 stating that identifying the stakeholders is not once and done, which oftentimes when we're thinking about our project as a project alone and not thinking about the entire transition that people need to make over time, we might think of checking the box that we identified the stakeholders. But stakeholders can come and go, and the influence of stakeholders can be high or low. In other words, it can change over the duration of our entire change initiative. So principle 2, again, identification is a continuous practice. New stakeholders emerge and old ones can fade away. There are all kinds of techniques for identifying stakeholders. We can get our change team or enough representative people, not too many, but enough representative people together and have an identification workshop. In doing so, we want to state what is the nature of the change, who do we think might be impacted, and then use techniques like brainstorming to be able to identify anybody who might potentially fit in the definitions we said on the earlier slides. Rapid listing is a form of brainstorming that is more structured in a way in that we are pairing off people and allowing them to rapidly list and then bringing them together to share lists. Again, just like brainstorming, to think broader than what one person might do by him or herself. We could use a technique called mind mapping to show where one stakeholder group might connect to another stakeholder group. So again, it's another form of working together. Instead of creating a list, this is using a visual. Again, whatever it takes for the team of people to identify everyone they possibly can, or every group they possibly can who could fit into this category. The last item here that we have, we're calling purposeful conversations. And that's happening during our time together as identification workshops, but always throughout our journey with our change. We might be talking to our boss, or we might be talking to a colleague and say, I was involved in this, and here's who we thought. That might prompt them to say, and did you think about? So again, there's more techniques than this, but in our short time together, that's what we're going to share with you. Now let's take all this into an example. So this is might seem like a pretty antiquated example anyways, going from paper-based in the bottom left-hand corner to an automated system. We could say for order taking, we could say at our dentist office, whatever that is. That's the change. Seems pretty easy, right? The people with the biggest impact are the people who went from recording on a paper-based system to now recording electronically. But let's look at this a little bit broader. For this particular initiative, who are the stakeholders? Well, if we were a project manager, the stakeholders that we're concerned about are the stakeholders who are influencing the project. Management, do we have the budget? Do we have the people? What are the deadlines? The developers, if this is truly an automation change, or the developers of business process if it's not necessarily technology or IT. Who are the users that are impacted? Who are the customers? But let's look at this a little bit differently, and I'm sure that this is not an exhaustive list, but a better list than what's on the left. Remember those criteria. External, like regulatory agencies. Do we have stakeholders that might influence our change because of things like HIPAA or things like PCI compliance? What about the training team that has to train on any business process change or technology change? What about any unions that might have something to say about changes in the work that part of the people who are their constituents have to do? So again, not an exhaustive list, but a bit bigger than what's on the left. All right, so we've got that list of stakeholders. Stakeholders, no matter who those stakeholders are, want to know one thing and only one thing about our change, and that is what's in it for me. What do I have to gain? What do I have to lose? And how am I going to participate in making this change? In other words, what is your clear plan for me to go from the old way to the new way? One way at looking at addressing this, what's in it for me, is a technique called empathy mapping. And so empathy mapping is through research, through interviews, through bringing people who are representative of different groups into our fold in our change team, we could start to understand what are people in a particular stakeholder group thinking and feeling about their current situation, whether they like or dislike the current technology, the current roles, the current organization, whatever we're changing, as well as potentially about the change that we want to make. What do they hear on a daily basis? What do they see? What do they say and do? Gathering this information could help us understand what are the potential pain elements that these stakeholders have that our solution will fix for them, and what are the potential gains. Giving us knowledge that you'll see next week will help us better plan out our effective communication strategy. In this case, help us better look at our engagement strategy to bring these people on board and get them to choose to be part of our change initiative. All right, so there's a technique that we throw at you, but let's go back to the groupings of stakeholders. We identified the stakeholders, and we have learned that it's not once and done. We continually need to look at new stakeholders through the duration of our change initiative. Bringing us to principle 3. We're going to segment stakeholders because we can't look at one of those empathy maps from the previous slide for every individual. And so we need to segment the stakeholders into groups of like characteristics and prioritize the engagement strategy, the communication strategy that we have for different stakeholder groups. Perhaps you felt a little overwhelmed when you looked at my list of stakeholder groups on the right, especially when I said it's probably not all. We can't do the same engagement, the same communication with each and every group, And so by prioritizing and segmenting, it will help us better cater our efforts to the people who need them the most today. And again, as we continually identify and prioritize, makes a proper shift for the right groups as the transition goes on. There are different elements that we could be looking at when we are understanding our stakeholder groups, and it depends on what we're trying to achieve. In the session that we're really looking at today and tied to the empathy map, it's more the third line here on the right, likely resistance to change and likelihood to adopt the innovation. That's information that we want to take forward with different stakeholder groups to help us understand how much engagement and how much influence that we need to help people understand that there is a better future for them. We also look at different stakeholder groups. The second row, the item on the left, level of influence and power. People who are on board with the change that we want to make and can help us influence others in the direction that hopefully is best for them. I'll leave you with this entire list again, rather than go over every single item. Again, so you can see that our role of prioritizing and segmenting, there are different next steps that we want to take depending on our goals. All right, so we have identified our stakeholders, we've segmented them, but now how do we engage them? Principle number 4, some stakeholders are best engaged by others. So what we're saying here is in many cases, people are better engaged, better influenced, better shown a better tomorrow by people who are like them, people who are their peers. So if we have some people who are on board quickly and want to take on or want to transition to the new way of working and have a positive story to tell, we want them to be champions or cheerleaders and help us share that story with people who are maybe on the sideline or on the fence doing the wait and see. Principle 5, seek first to understand and then be understood. So this is a Stephen Covey session or quote. Stephen Covey looking at a number of books, one of those books being How to Influence Others, so effectively influencing others. So seek first to understand. The empathy map that we showed earlier helps us do that. Understand people where they are and then see how our solution can benefit them going forward. Principle 6, emotion trumps reason. And so we could continue to give the facts and explain why and talk to people and give them data, but really to get people to be on board and to want to transition to our new way of working, really we need to hit them with both their heads and hit them is probably a bad word, but really we need to be able to influence both their head and their heart. So people justify rationally after an emotional response, something that helps them understand why we can't continue to be working the way that we are. And finally, principle number 7, demonstration trumps argument. And so the more we can show people the way, the more that we can provide early trial, if you will, or pilot to new technologies or to new roles. Or if, for instance, we are building a new corporate headquarters, the earlier we could put a model of the new building and where people will sit, and yes, there's still going to be a cafeteria or whatever people are curious about, the more we can demonstrate, the more it gives people something to talk about, to understand what they like and what they don't like, to be able to understand the benefits to them, and you'll see the last statement here, providing the reason to believe. All right, this was really quick, going through 7 principles of stakeholder engagement. Again, Not doing this oftentimes takes the projects that we want to have successful in helping people transition to a new way of working, either to be not exactly as effective as we want them to be, or to cause so much churn that there's angst in the organization, or have them fail outright. The more we are able to do this, the more successful we'll be. Again, I mentioned this is our last slide. I provided a reading list for you. I want to point out 2 references that tie into the 7 principles we just talked about. The very last at the bottom, the Effective Change Manager's Handbook. Mr. Mayfield had a whole chapter in that book about stakeholder engagement, specifically tying in with these 7 principles. And you can see he has his own book, 3 from the bottom, Practical People Engagement, Leading Change Through the Power of Relationships. That's what this is all about. It is understanding, relating to others, and helping them through the transitions we are encouraging them to go through. I want to share with you if I get there, my email address. I'd like to invite you to email me if you have any questions or comments. I've given you a little bit of understanding of stakeholder engagement, and if you have any questions, I'm trying to look in the Q&A, please let us know. Okay, I'm seeing that there aren't any questions. Hopefully you have a few takeaway points from this. We are recording this session. The recording and the slide deck will be sent to you by our Pink Elephant corporate team. Actually, I see a hand up. Sharon, I don't know if that's for now. If you could type in your question. I see a question. What are some of the most common barriers to effective change management that you have found? You want that whole list, huh? Okay. The most common barriers to effective change management that I have found are the fact that we don't communicate the change well. So the barriers that come up, so barriers, this might not be the exact question. Barriers are people who resist the change. Barriers are people who could be influential in different levels of management that also resist change. Those are the barriers, but why they are common in that they affect or impact our change is really because we don't address the concerns through the proper communication early enough and well enough. And by that, I mean we communicate, but we haven't taken the time to understand some of those engagement elements that we just talked about and really how to tie our change in our communications into the what's in it for me. And in not doing so, people are anxious, they're afraid of what they might lose, including an identity of their role or who they are. And so that's the cause and effect. Trez, I kind of talked on and on. I don't have an easy answer to any question. Hopefully that helps you. Okay. It is complex, and every change is different, and every person is different, which is why this exercise of understanding and using something like an empathy map helps us and needs to be done every change. We can't take one from the past change and take it to this new change because the circumstances are different for each one. Any other questions? I am seeing them come through. Do you? All right. I want to thank you for your time. I hope you get some use out of the slides as well as some of the references that I have shared with you. And I sincerely hope that we see you next week. Take care.